everyone, and thank you for tuning in to WHU Inside Business. Today, I'm delighted to be hosting Kai Herzberger here with us. Some of you will be well acquainted here. He's not an unfamiliar name and face for our show and our viewers here. But suffice it to say, Kai, you've had a tremendous journey at Facebook last 7 years, and before, obviously, quite an interesting background with both Deutsche Telekom and your time in what we like to say in Germany, the Gründerzene and startup mode. Love to hear a little bit more from you about what makes you you, and also a little bit more about the journey that you've taken.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Dan, for having me. And I need to say I have goosebumps, in particular by the intro, because WHU is something special for me. It's something which we call at Meta like the social graph. I've been there to kind of do my executive MBA, and just kind of seeing the logo of WHU and kind of the intro and kind of talking to you guys, it's getting really, really goosebumps. So I'm still kind of having those goosebumps. So bit of background on me. As you can see, I'm a bit older. I'm gray, but I'm also grateful for the time that I have and still have. I think my background is literally, I've grown up in the 74. I was born where Germany was World Soccer Championship. So it's kind of that time of the year.
First world days.
And I've started my career in traditional and then have moved into digital and really stayed in digital since the end of the 90s in particular. And I think what is important to say is everyone talks about change and transformation. I think in particular when we talk about digital, transformation is happening every day. But it's something where you don't need to be kind of anxious about. It's always kind of coming with a positive mindset and not with a negative mindset. And I think that is something which is driving me every day, is looking into how to build up the next big thing together, because that togetherness is in particular the one thing I've always been focused upon. And I think the passion that I have is people, because it's all about people. It's not about competition. It's really about people, because we can only kind of solve the problems that we all have, the company process, but also the social environments that we are all living in now, also during the pandemic. We can only do that together.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think, especially in this more digitalizing world, and we're obviously going to touch on that, this people aspect sometimes get forgotten. And whether we're talking about in the context of B2C marketing or just general leadership skill set that we are trying to instill here at WHU, that's a topic that, of course, we're going to dive into a bit more detail. I think really just to give us a bit more of an introduction, I'd love to understand the journey that you've taken with Facebook over the last couple of years. Obviously, you're now both in a DACH and an EMEA wide role looking after e-commerce, but it's been quite a journey and it's continuing to be. Perhaps in your own words, I mean, what are the key highlights that you've seen so far?
I'm still feeling like in the startup mode, right? And there's a say here at Meta, which says this journey is 1% finished. I think it's so simple, that sentence, but there's so much truth and boldness in there, because it tells you and it reflects you every day to kind of build for the future. Because we are not building for here. Yes, we do have the products for here, but we are building for the future. And I think if you look back the last almost 8 years that I'm now with Facebook Meta, or Facebook and now, as we call us, Meta, the journey hasn't changed, frankly to say. The questions that we have are getting more and more complex, and the solutions that we have to find are getting also more complex. But at the end, you have to break it down again, kind of to that one center piece, which is kind of people. And that's also on how our teams and my team in particular is kind of consulting our ecosystem out there. So the industries that we are working in, because the fundamental thing that I think, which is sometimes forgotten in companies, is getting back to that people-centric view. And it's sometimes that C levels, but also VP levels, director levels, but also operational levels are so much in that work today that they are missing out, kind of flying high again. So I'm always saying at the moment, so what you have to do is as someone working in marketing, sales, digital, and that's super exciting, is kind of think yourself as a drone, right? Which can fly high up, see like the macro view on an ecosystem and industry, but you also have the ability to really go deep. We're always talking about something like a T-shaped model, where the T could be like the roof, so the horizontal layer is something like growth, where your own growth comes as well as a person. And then kind of the vertical level, like the layer of the T, is literally where it goes deep. And that's also something when I'm thinking about my career, right? So yes, I have a lovely title, but frankly to say, my job hasn't changed over the last 8 years. It only has kind of expanded in the responsibilities that I have and in the role that I have in particular. But it definitely always follows that T. So one is kind of finding those growth moments, but on the other hand is really going deep on the things to understand the bits and pieces to consult companies that we are working on in the industry best.
I'd love to pick up on this startup culture and preserving this a little more, because obviously your early background is being in startups all the way down to through to exit. But we often see this in fan company, or I should probably say man company now that you've rebranded, that they have this tendency to preserve a startup culture. Is that really the case? Do you still feel like you are operating in a startup environment today?
I still feel like that. And I think it also holds true for all of the other regions and countries. So if you would kind of ask my colleagues, my peer levels and so on, they would tell you the same. Also, we are in size now a couple of thousand people, right? So, but nevertheless, that startup mentality has still be there. And I think it's born in the culture of the company that Mark Zuckerberg and the leadership team have in particular set out. There's one thing when you start onboarding with us. So your initial, like your first day, or there's a couple of weeks that you're doing onboarding, but the initial day, normally our chief product officer is coming in. So in the name of Chris Cox, and he has a simple word which says, "It's your company now." And if you let it sink, right, it doesn't say it's a company. It says it's your company. Yeah. So what that means, in particular, it's your baby now. So you need to feel, you need to embrace it. You need to kind of, there will be tough times. There will also be positive times, but it's up to you and each individual in particular, and then kind of broader teams where you're coming together and building those connections, and building that up. There's a say that I'm always saying is, you have to be passionate about going the extra mile. And what I mean with that is we are all living in comfort zones, right? So, and that's a normal human being.
Absolutely.
But take the risk of going that one step further and fail, because there will be times where you fail. And I think that's the startup mentality that we also see in Europe, that we see in the Valley, that we see also if you go east. It's kind of, don't be afraid to fail, but take responsibility. And that is something what you normally don't see in some more traditional companies, kind of that risk awareness. I think what we have to educate all of us, which are operating in the industry, is take the risk, because there will be potentially others which will overtake you from the left or right. And don't see them as competition. See them as an ingredient to something to reflect on yourself if you're still on the right track. I think that is what we have deeply in our DNA at Meta, and which is in particular building us hopefully for the future that we're going towards.
I want to pick up on this enablement, empowerment, sense of ownership. Now, it's great to say I want to embolden my team to fail, but in reality, how can you reward something like that, especially in a broader context? I mean, you were at Deutsche Telekom. I'm sure if you had failed there at some point, the reaction would have been quite different. How do you manage that as a director of your own team?
I think there are three components to that one. One is you need to have non-priorities as well. So not only have priorities, but also non-priorities, because those non-priorities are in particular kind of giving the way, right? So it's not the priorities only, it's also the non-priorities which give you the day. The second piece, and I think that is in particular why you were asking on the startup mentality, is authentic self. So be your authentic self, because normally what I've seen also when I was in startups, I've seen that people try to adjust a bit to the founder structure, to the investor structure and so on. But I think that the startups which are predominant successful are the ones where they still have their authentic self, where they have a DNA, where they have like something which is really built in the roots. And the third one is you have to be vocal. And it doesn't mean that you have to be loud out there, right? So be like the largest voice, but be vocal and have a position. And I think that is something where sometimes, in particular, like young startups and also like Series A, B startups are sometimes moving away a bit, kind of keeping their position. In particular, when there is some investors coming in, kind of challenging them on the KPIs, still have that position, because that is responsibility and accountability in one, and that's what you have to embrace.
Look, fascinating topic. I kind of want to take a step back and talk about the macros, especially in the context of the metaverse as well. It's been quite a tumultuous, well, eventful, I should say, 18 months, let alone from COVID completely disrupting, I think is a fair way of saying, the digital and more specifically e-commerce space, to unfortunately some less pleasant news about obviously boycotts of Facebook brand earlier in 2020, and now complete rebrand overarchingly. What's your take on it? What's it been like being on the inside? I'd love to get your perspective here.
Yeah, I think like the name change is something which is really like emotional when you're coming from the inside, which is kind of that positive protagonist thing that we all have, definitely. But it's something which is not kind of being built out of like a surprise. It is something that you could have seen is like a journey that the company has gone through, right? And I think it was the right time doing it now, because we are now, and not we, but we as an industry, right? So, and that's why the metaverse, as you're talking about it, is not something that we will only invent and that we will only focus upon. It's that togetherness. So we can only do it together with other companies out there, and with other people in particular out of the engineering world. And that is so exciting. And it also gives you, when you look into it, so we have Facebook, we have Instagram, we have WhatsApp, we have Messenger, we have Oculus, and a couple of other things. So when you think now kind of where to put the resources and how to build efficiencies, also from a people first perspective, Meta is definitely helping on that end as well, because now we can focus deep. So coming back to that T model, right? So Meta is kind of the crow's perspective where we're going into the future. And now we can really go an additional deeper step into the different properties that we have. And at the end, what is Meta, or what is the metaverse? It's a set of digital spaces, including definitely like immersive 3D experiences, but where the fundamental central point is interconnection. And it's a simple word again, but interconnection means it's the interconnection of different things coming together, right? It's also the hybrid of a real world and a virtual world, but the interconnection of different companies, different apps, different digital spaces coming together, where we as human beings can kind of experience the things of shared experiences. When I'm always thinking about, my brother lives in the US, so you can call him, right? You can do the video call. But if I want to be present with his Christmas day, I'm not able to do that. Other than he's kind of showing me the phone, right, which is like a 2D experience. He might use something like a 3D experience, but you can't be present as a person there. And with the metaverse that all of us will build, you will feel that there is no difference between a virtual and real world, hopefully at like in the next 5 to 10 years, because that it's something which will take that long to develop.
Sure.
But you will feel being in that presence. And I think that is so fundamentally important. Also, it's coming more from a marketing sales perspective, but when I'm thinking about also other industries, let's face it, you mentioned the pandemic. Doctors coming together, right? Solving for something. It's something kind of written, right, which sits on servers and so on. But feel that if a doctor can be like with you on that ICU station, who's sitting potentially in Dubai while the patient is in Cologne, right? So it's those kind of elements that I think will definitely make a difference. And it's that hybrid model that we already had, which is just kind of the next computing platform that we will build.
No, and let's pick up a little bit here in terms of specifically e-commerce. Obviously, quite famously, you're starting to introduce a marketplace on WhatsApp, one of the innovation that we as consumer are going to be experiencing, and very much looking forward to that. But where do you see the trends here more generally? Are we moving away from just the Facebook and Instagram marketplace towards items like streams and WhatsApp? So what's your take on this?
I think there are 3 dimensions to that. One is what you feel, and it has nothing to do with Meta and like our properties in particular. You have the feeling that there's like something happening, which is discovery commerce, which is you're not searching for a product that you want, or like a service like in former times. So literally it's still there, right? We still do that.
Sure.
If I'm thinking also about Black Friday and Cyber Monday still. But the discovery point has like the notion of the ability for companies to shine in front of people, which people don't have in the relevant set. So that's kind of the first piece where we are building also a couple of additional focus areas together with our partners like a Shopify and others. Like that's the dimension that we will definitely take for the next 2-3 years in building out that discovery commerce engine. The second piece is, and that's always having like people first in mind, right? So it's kind of how can you get a product in front of a person and wow that person? So that's the fundamental underlying thing around that. The second piece, why you bring up WhatsApp, is or kind of messaging services. It's already there. We just need to have to look to the east, right? Don't look to the west, look to the east, because that's where innovation will definitely also come from. We've seen that with a couple of messaging services out of China, out of Asia Pacific in particular. And what the underlying factor behind that, and I'm talking about conversational commerce, it's like that notion. What it is reducing the friction of a purchase, but not only stopping at the purchase, but thinking about like along the line, what is then happening after you have received your product, right? There might be customer service things happening. There might be new purchases coming alongside of the initial product that you have purchased. So that's kind of the notion of conversational commerce. And then for me, the next step is definitely something which we are calling like zero friction, which is thinking about the customer journey as its best, because we know that like app load times, too many clicks in the purchase journey, they have an opportunity cost. We are talking in Europe, for example, we are talking about 86 billion euros opportunity costs in a year because of friction in customer journeys, and that's a huge number. And that's the whole idea around also like shop ads. The checkout experience that we have launched as a beta version in the US is reducing the friction of the customer journey by putting people first again. There's nothing to do that we want to enter like the e-com space. It's just kind of purely looking into, okay, where's friction and how can we reduce friction by doing better than what is out there today.
I want to touch on this geography point a little bit more detail. Obviously, especially on our marketing side, we see a lot of innovation coming from the West, or specifically US. You mentioned Black Friday is one example, which clearly we have all experienced last week. The point, however, that I'd like to find out a bit more is, what about Europe? We're seeing models like Spotify come up, Delivery Hero, Deliveroo. You're perhaps closest to businesses like that as one of their core partners. What's your view on this? Are we going to see hopefully another renaissance in innovation here in Europe?
We will. And I can only invite everyone, and in particular also the people studying at WHU, think about Europe first. Because if you're gonna solve it in Europe, you will solve for the world. And that has two dimensions. One is data privacy, for sure, because we are the most regulated market out there. But the second piece is that's back to kind of our roots, where we are coming from, as in particular DACH, or like Germans, Austrian and Swiss people, is the focus on quality. And the focus on quality will be something that we will see going forward, which will be a more important factor going forward. And I think what we should really be proud of as Europeans is AR and VR technology. The centers of AR and VR technology of all the big digital players are literally sitting in Europe. Right? So all the kind of research pieces and so on, they are happening in Paris, Zurich, London, and so on. So we should be really proud. And that's again, I think, like the mind shift that needs to happen in Europe. Europe has always been, and there's history why that is, has always been a bit more like the challenger region. Let's take it into a positive momentum and say, let's be a challenger so true to ourselves, but let's play offense in thinking about, okay, what can we really build on that quality piece, because that is our heritage as Europeans for the world. And you see that with export, right? So we are one of the largest export nations or regions still. So there's still like proof points to that, why EMEA will still do great. And I can only kind of ask everyone, hey, don't look always west, don't look always east. Yes, do it, but take the ingredients of that innovation coming from those markets, take it in, shake it, and get the next best placebo out there, which is better than potentially what the US or what Asia will build.
And we see this actually reflected in academia, not just from a technical perspective, but let's take WHU as an example, right? We've instituted a Masters in Entrepreneurship here, which I have to say cultivates a completely different set of thinking. We have Idea Lab most famously as well, which I'm sure some of our viewers are also going to be well acquainted with. What's your advice to these young entrepreneurs? And they don't necessarily need to be in a specific course. I think a lot of their thinking will be at least coming from the whole consulting, investment banking. You can't go wrong with that. Entrepreneurship, however, I think suffice to say, is quite a potentially risky move. What's your take on this? What's your advice for these young individuals considering a step like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're asking someone who has been in the space, but who has been also a bit of not the real person in that space. And what I mean with that is the following. I've seen startups like growing like hell and great founders growing like hell as well, and then failing definitely. And the fail is in particular because they are like overworked. They are not thinking about themselves. They are not thinking sometimes about their workforce. So be realistic to yourself. That means a 16-hour a day, you can do it, but it's not sufficient and not sustainable to do it like for 2 years. That's one. The second one for like all the startups out there is everyone goes for an exit strategy, but why? Right? So why going for an exit? You can see that with the likes of us. You can see that with the likes of like a Tesla, who's also a startup, also in the automobile sector, but totally different. So take a step back and think about what you want to build and what you want to be associated as a person for, because an association to a dollar amount that you have by IPOing or exiting is not the thing. And we are seeing great founders which are coming from WHU, right? If you think about like the Zalando founders, if you think about also other founders in the marketplace, that there's always that sustainable founding company is one of the big pieces. And the third recommendation I have is think always what you can do with others together, because you will not solve alone. So you have to kind of build your network. You have to build your social craft by building kind of the next notion of growth ship for your startup. So that is something you have to bear in mind.
No, couldn't agree more. Let's use this as a nice transition to talk about specifically in the context of B2C, but even potentially B2B marketing and e-commerce. I mean, Facebook or Meta themselves published a report earlier this year highlighting just this huge amount of consumer shift from two perspectives. One, from a business perspective of us becoming much more comfortable shopping online and this becoming a permanent situation, but also consumers becoming much more conscious about how data is used. If we think about it in the business context, where do you see the trends, both from yourself at a Meta perspective, but also the partners that you operate with? What are the key trends in the market that you think we should be aware of?
I think there are a couple of trends, and that's a good question. A couple of trends that we will see. So one is definitely that data and privacy will be one of the key themes going forward. So there's definitely a trend there that we all have to embrace. The second piece, I think, where you're going to see growth in particular is two things. One is e-government. So e-government will be hopefully going not only through a renaissance, but through a growth perspective and some disruption and revolution. And the second one is e-health. So in particular, the pandemic has shown us on what we have to change when it comes down not only to consulting about health, but also bringing health people together in the interaction of solving for diseases. And the third piece is if we're just purely looking on EMEA, and we touched base on that one, is EMEA has the notion of ER and VR technology is sitting already here, right? So we will be one of the future growth drivers for all of the things happening on the new computing platforms. And I'm super excited that we are sitting in EMEA and have the ability to take the ingredients from the East and the West, but kind of shape it in the way that it's an EMEA way of growth perspective.
And on that, obviously, as a former WHU alumni, love to get your perspective. What's the advice you'd give to, well, a master's, bachelor's, and MBA graduates here? What would you perhaps done differently, even if you were a graduate today?
I would definitely have looked into more different industries and not focusing on the one. I know that everyone goes for financial service, investment banking, consulting. Go to the traditional ones, because in the traditional scenario, you have to work on transformation. And transformation is super exciting, right? So it sometimes it's a bit of a challenge, but it's super exciting because you're directly seeing what you built for. So take more steps into kind of feeling, embracing, learning from the different industries which are out there. The second piece of advice which I really have is work hard, play hard. I know it's something at WHU, which everyone does. That's why I think like WHU is one of the great resources and universities that we not only have in Germany, but like globally and in Europe, is take the notion of play hard as well. And what I mean with that, you need to have fun. You need to really have fun together and stay connected to your kind of peers, which we're going through a couple of years on studying in particular, because that's the network which you can rely on. We have done that at least for the executive master MBA that we have done. So we are still in contact after 20 years now, or almost 20 years now, after having finished that one. So I think it's kind of take that for granted. You've built up new relationships and keep those relationships.
I couldn't agree more. And perhaps no better way of doing it is through, of course, social media. And I guess the obvious question here, I mean, what's your take on it? Clearly, from a business perspective, it's hugely important to your life. On a personal level, are you also a keen partaker in social media platforms?
I'm definitely, yes. I would say I'm a geek of social media. I would even rephrase it now because we are not social media again. I think we are moving into social technology. So it's more about social technology now. And I'm a geek, right? I definitely use kind of our properties, but I'm also using on the business side like the different business platforms which are out there. And it's because of the third point that I made. It's kind of staying in contact, staying in the relationship that you have built up for years while being on university or working in a company together. And I'm a big believer in social because they're social, right? It's not about kind of the technology and the apps that we use. It's around the social moment, and there is so much you can learn from, and so much to reflect on, and so much to be proud of, but so much also emotions which are in there.
Couldn't agree more. Kai, I think we've almost run out of time, so really from my side, thank you so much for being on the show. And it's always a pleasure to host yourself here on WHU Inside Business. Before we tune out, any concluding thoughts that you want to leave our audience on?
Yeah, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Dan, and the whole WHU environment. I'm always super happy being back. Also, we are not at Burgplatz today, but I'm feeling I'm standing in the middle of Burgplatz together with you while you are in the studio there. So really, really thankful and grateful for the partnership and for the relationship that we have. The second one advice I have is I think we are living in times where it is not easy. It is not easy to stay focused. But I think there's one thing that I'm saying. Always think about your friends and families first, together with you. Don't think about all of the things which you can do in a 24-hour thing, but think about your family and friends first.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the kind words, and again for taking the time to talk to us here today. And most importantly, thank you, viewers, for joining in. And as always, like and subscribe, tune into our next show, and we look forward to welcoming you back again in the not too distant future.